Okay, so we've talked about a very biological set of motives, hunger. We've talked about things that are clearly more psychological, like the meta motives and self-determination theory. Let's look at the need for belong. So remember, one of the components of the meta motives was affiliation, and one of the components of self-determination theory is relatedness. Also, Maslow had something interesting to say. He thought that after we took care of our most basic needs, humans experience a deficit need of love and belonging. In other words, Maslow believed that we have a drive to experience a sense of love and belonging. And when we don't have this, we experience a deficit that motivates us to go out and get it. He even thinks love and belonging comes before our self-esteem and sense of self. The idea that the need to connect with people is a drive raised some questions in psychology. Is this need to feel like we belong within our groups, is it more psychological? Is it more like an implicit motive? And remember, implicit motives, what they push us to do is to have experiences that generate internal states. So a feeling that we recognize in our mind, like achievement or affiliation. So one thing that we know a desire for connection, a desire to belong, a desire for attachment represents is a desire to achieve this inner state of feeling connected, feeling a part of something. But is it also biological? Does it have to do with our nervous system, our brain, our endocrine system, the hormone system? Do our neurotransmitters create a very physiological need that's almost closer to hunger for closeness? Well, today, most psychologists believe that the need to belong, the need to connect, is both at the same time. That we have these implicit motives driving us for affiliation and relationships, but we also have these biological needs that have evolved for relationships. Remember, for thousands of years, many things could eat us. And by bonding together in groups, not only were we more likely to survive infancy, we were more likely to survive in general. And this resulted in a press to form connections, groups, and feel like we belong within a community. So YouTube won't let me show you this video. If we were in class, I would just show it to you. So what I want you to do is pause my video right now, right here. And then below in the comments, you'll see I've posted a link. Click on that link. It will take you to a very brief 3-minute video that will show Harry Harlow in his monkey experiments. Once you've done that, and that video is finished, come back, unpause my video, and go to the next slide. Let me give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, here are some key points from the video that you just watched. First, monkeys could choose to spend time with the cloth mother who couldn't feed them or the wire mother that could feed them. And what Harlow saw was universally the monkeys spent more time with the cloth mother. Second, universally, when the monkeys were threatened, and what you saw in the video, so they scared the monkeys would seek comfort and closeness, physical proximity with the cloth mother, not the wire mother that fed them. Over time, closeness with the cloth mother resulted in a change in the monkey's internal state. So what you saw is they went from extremely scared to they would become aggressive, even taunting towards the thing that had initially scared them. What this indicates is that a sense of security provided by the cloth mother changes how the monkey experiences the environment. This led Harlow and others to conclude that what humans call love is more than just hunger love. Some people, like Freud and Anna Freud, both of whom I really respect, but they thought that the reason that you loved your parents was sort of negative reinforcement. You experience this painful or uncomfortable state, like hunger. You're fed by the parent. The hunger goes away. You start to classically condition that positive feeling of the hunger going relief and the the hunger going away and the relief you experience with the parent, and this is the basis of love, they thought. But Harlow says this doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be that we love people that we have a lot of proximity with, who can comfort with us and create a sense of bonding and closeness. Harlow's research was one factor that pioneered research into what is today known as attachment theory. This is John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. They theorized and did research to show that humans have an inborn attachment system. How this system works is it creates a drive to attach. Similar to how Chomsky said, we have a drive to acquire language that is naturally within us. Bowlby, Ainsworth, and attachment theory argues we have an attachment system that creates a natural drive to form some close relationships with key others in our life. Any of you that are familiar with small children, so kids under the age of 2, are well aware that children and infants show a preference for caregivers they are highly familiar with. They don't just want any adult. They want the adults that they are attached to. A part of what our attachments do is they balance the child's need for exploration with their needs for protection. Here, what Bowlby and Ainsworth are saying is that this motivation to develop attachments evolved because if we explored without protection, we would die. At the same time, if we clung to our parents and our caregivers and we never explored, we wouldn't stimulate our brain, we wouldn't develop skills, etc. So there needs to be a system that balances our need for exploration and skill development and stimulation with our needs for familiarity, protection, and comfort. Given this particular theory, they argued that one of the things that should turn on the attachment system is a threat. And they believe there are 2 types of threats. One is an unwanted separation from the attachment figure. How we as adults can relate to this is when our romantic partners leave or are hurt or go into the hospital, we experience some distress by this. If you've ever worked in a nursery or a kindergarten, what you'll see is that when parents leave, very young children will become distressed and it's difficult to soothe. But there are other things that are experienced as threatening to a child. Pain, discomfort, illness, fear. These too will turn on the attachment system. So it's not just physical threats, it's also threats to attachment that turn the system on. So when the system's turned on, what happens? Okay. So imagine, let's start in the upper left quadrant of this slide where we've got this little baby, they're playing, and the green box says exploring. So the way that children explore the world is they play. So this kid is happily exploring the environment, having a good time. Let's say they fall down and they feel some pain. This causes them distress. That turns the attachment system on. For a very young child, when the attachment system comes on, they're going to seek closeness, just like the monkey. So they're going to start looking for someone that they are attached to. They don't want any adult. They want an adult or a caregiver that they have an attachment with. They'll go to that attachment figure. The caregiver will provide them with support. You say things to your child like, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, you scraped your knee. Let's get out the Mickey Mouse Band-Aids. And you'll put the Band-Aid on and you'll say nice things. And what you'll see is slowly but surely, the child will start to calm down. And we call that calming feeling felt security. It's an internal sense of safety. And this turns off the attachment system. So the child again feels secure. Their distress comes down. Now they return to exploring. And so this cycle is designed to, once triggered, a caregiver helps take care of the child. As they feel secure, now they can go back to exploring the environment until they feel threatened again, and the cycle continues. But many of you are adults. Every time you're upset, do you go running back physically to your parents? Of course not. Bowlby says that the way that we can achieve felt security increases with age and development. For example, when we're very young, we really rely on our parents. When we get older, we start to rely on our peers more. We might even rely on romantic partners. But the other thing that we are able to do is use a mental representation, an internal representation of an attachment figure. So for example, if something bad happened to me, I might be feeling sad, and I might think in my own mind, what would my parents say to me? What would my relational partners say to me? How would they support me? And just by thinking of them, I feel more secure. I can go back out and take on the challenge again. So the point of this is part of how the attachment system is definitely a motivational system, is it's evolutionarily involved. There are some individual differences, but the way the system generally works is it balances exploration with the need for safety and protection. We're exploring. When over the course of exploring we're distressed or we're upset, we do something based on our developmental level that utilizes an attachment figure in some way. When this is experienced as supportive, we achieve felt security, an internal sense of safety, and this allows us to return to exploring. But attachment is not the only reason that humans have a need to belong. We also have desires to feel a part of something, to feel a part of community. But then how do I understand things like bullying? How do I understand things like violence and aggression towards other groups? Well, there are many explanations, but one of them is I might bully, or I might be violent, or I might join a particular group where we actually hate other people because that makes us feel more connected. We also know that feeling like one does not belong feels particularly bad to humans. Ostracism is the idea that someone is actively excluding us from the group. We're being shunned. We're being actively isolated. It's not an accident. People are doing this on purpose. We've always known that ostracism causes people a lot of psychological distress. We now know through research on the brain that ostracism actually causes a lot of activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. And this is where people feel pain. If you fall down and break your leg, you will feel physical pain from your anterior cingulate cortex. It turns out that when we feel excluded from groups, we feel that people are intentionally isolating us, we feel pain in the same part of the brain as physical pain. That's how important feeling like we belong and connected is to us, that the body produces pain when we feel we are being blocked from achieving it. We're also going to use some of the research on the benefits of belongingness to review some terms that will be on the final exam. There are many benefits to feeling like we belong. For example, research consistently shows that people with strong interpersonal relationships are less at risk for health problems, psychiatric disorders, and stress. Another way of saying it, which is more professional and evokes statistics, is when we do research and we measure the quality and strengths of your relationships, the quality and strengths of the amount of social support you have, we see that these variables are negatively correlated with health problems, psychiatric disorder, and stress. Remember, a negative correlation means as one variable goes up, the other goes down. Ergo, when interpersonal relationships are more present and higher quality, i.e. they go up, risk for health problems, psychiatric disorders, and stress goes down. Conversely, when the quality of our interpersonal relationships go down, risk for health problems, psychiatric disorders, and stress goes up. We've also studied this in other contexts. For example, the more an employee feels like they are part of the community, that they belong, that they feel a part of this company, the higher their job satisfaction, and the greater their organizational commitment. In other words, the greater they feel connected to the mission of the organization and motivated to try to achieve it. The way that we say this correctly in psychology is to use a positive correlation. So as employee belongingness goes up, job satisfaction goes up, and organizational commitment goes up. So what would happen if employee belongingness goes down? If you guess that job satisfaction goes down and organizational commitment goes down, you guessed right. So a positive correlation is a relationship where as one variable goes up, the other goes up. As one variable goes down, the other goes down. Remember, we can only look at correlations between two variables. So when we ran these studies, we first look at belongingness and job satisfaction. Then we look at belongingness and organizational commitment. This is why we generate numbers to reflect specific relationships. However, should we trust these relationships? And what I mean is, should we believe that these relationships are real and that knowing about them is actually useful, that it could actually tell us what to do? Should we care about these findings? Scientists figure this out using two things: statistical significance, did it occur by chance, and effect size. What is the size or the meaningfulness of the effect? And we most care about findings when the effect size is medium to large. You guys do not need to know the number ranges. I just want you to understand what the statistical significance concept is and the effect size concept is. But for the sake of clarity on this specific slide, the effects I'm presenting to you are large effects. In other words, not only are these relationships statistically significant between belongingness, job satisfaction, and organizational commitment, but the effects are large, which means these relationships are likely to be quite meaningful and have big impacts. Thus, employers should actually care about employee belongingness. Let's back up and talk about statistical significance again, because this is definitely on the exam. The core question that statistical significance addresses is, did an effect or is a relationship, did it occur by chance? What the number, sometimes referred to as a p-value, tells us is the probability that the result is a fluke, that it just occurred by chance. When we say a finding or a relationship is statistically significant, what that means is there's a less than 5% probability. So there's a very low probability that the finding is due to random chance. So we want our results to be statistically significant. However, just because they're statistically significant doesn't mean they're all that important. Statistical significance is impacted by sample size, and this is something that is really important to know. What this means is studies that have a lot of people in them will make everything significant. All associations, all findings will appear to not have occurred by chance because we have so many people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're meaningful. This is where effect size comes in. You can think of effect size as answering the question, is the size of the effect or the magnitude of the effect large enough to be useful at some level? What the effect size tells us, and it's a number, it tells us the magnitude or the strength of a finding, effect, or relationship. So the effect size tells us how strong is the relationship between employee belongingness and job satisfaction. Knowing this helps us understand if we should do something with the finding. When an effect size is in the trivial range, that means it's meaningless. Even if it was statistically significant, it's meaningless. We can't use this. It won't help us make decisions. It won't help us do anything better. When an effect size is small, it might be useful for theory, but it's not going to be very useful for people or for companies or for doctors. We start to care about findings when effect sizes are at least medium. This means that the magnitude of the impact, the strength of the impact, and the number of people likely to be impacted is big enough that we think it could be useful. And finally, when effects are large, we are very confident that the findings are likely to be useful. Finally, a great thing about effect size is it's not impacted by study sample size. So we have one variable, statistical significance, where how many people you study mattered, and one variable, effect size, where it doesn't. And this is a nice check and balance. So when are results most valuable? Well, let's say that a study produces a big effect, but those effects are not statistically significant. Well, I don't care. Because even though you generated those big effects, it's possible that those big effects occurred by chance, and so they wouldn't be likely to occur again. Well, what about the reverse situation? What if a finding is very statistically significant, but it produces trivial effects? Again, I don't care. Because you might have had a really big sample, and even though you found statistical significance, your relationships or your effects are likely to be meaningless. Meaning, if we made decisions based on them, we wouldn't be better off than if we didn't use them to make decisions. We start to care about findings when their statistical significance and effects are medium or large. Now I care, and I'm starting to think these data could be useful and help me make decisions. It's important, though, to understand that when we read research, we should keep a healthy level of skepticism. Healthy skepticism doesn't mean you're dismissing everything as false. It doesn't mean you don't believe in science. It doesn't mean that you don't believe in research. It means that you understand that findings obtained in a large group of people may not apply to everyone. So one productive way to use your healthy skepticism is to do a sort of personal experiment. For example, maybe what I do is I rate my stress every day for a week without any changes to my life. Then I increase the amount of time I'm spending with others for a week, and I rate my stress every day. Then I go back to my baseline, I kind of cleanse my palate, if you will, and again, I'm just living my normal life, and I rate stress for that week. And then finally, I actually reduce the time I'm spending with others, and I rate my stress. Obviously, I made these data up, but it could potentially look something like this. So my baseline stress the first time was a 6. The second time it was a 7. When I increased times with others, it went down. When I reduced time, it went up to an 8. Doing something like this is not going to be perfect, although there are more statistically precise ways to do it. But it helps me make my own decisions. And it helps me think like, okay, that research that they found with a bunch of people, does it actually apply to me? Now, some of you are probably thinking, but if I know I did the study, it might influence the study. And you're right. There are a lot of situations in which that can occur. So another way in which we make our own decisions is we learn about research methods and we learn about research rigor to figure out who we are going to trust and who we are not going to trust to help us make these decisions. So let's talk about an area of research that is very interesting to many young people. Let's look at use of social media and well-being. And I picked this particular line of research because people have a lot of pre-existing beliefs about it. We're going to look at what actual studies say. Does social media reduce our well-being, increase our well-being, or have no effect on well-being? The first type of study that we'll look at is an experiment. In Alcott's study, the question was, does social media usage cause an impact on well-being? So does it cause it to improve or cause it to get worse? Remember, only experiments can be used to generate cause and effect conclusions. They took a large number of young adults who describe themselves as regular social media site users, SMS users. So these are people who use social media. And they randomly put people into one of a couple of groups. There was an experimental group, and what this group did is they activated the social media site. Now, they still had access to messaging through the social media site, but they were blocked from using that form of social media. In the control group, these folks just used social media as they typically were. So what did they find? Well, the control variable in this study is which group are you in and how is that group using or not using social media. The dependent variable were things like times with others. How much time are you spending with others and what was your well-being? What they found was the experimental group experienced an increase in the time that they were with other people. In other words, on average, people in the experimental group spent more time with others than did people in the control group. They also had individuals rate their well-being on a regular basis. And what they find was people in the experimental group rated themselves as having higher well-being relative to people in the control group. Also, they found that the people in the experimental group, when they followed up with them later after the study was done, reported a reduction in their use of social media since being in the study. At first, you might be tempted to draw the conclusion, yeah, it's bad, based on this one study and on your pre-existing beliefs. But we want to be skeptical. Part of why we want to be skeptical is there are a lot of alternative explanations that could explain this finding. For example, students or young people often have pre-existing beliefs that social media is bad. Maybe their ratings of subjective well-being, for example, were influenced by knowing that they weren't in the social media group. This would make it look like not being exposed to social media had a positive impact, even if that wasn't necessarily the cause. But another way in which we want to have healthy skepticism involves we never want to make too much out of one study. The first time I talked about healthy skepticism, I was talking about the importance of understanding that a particular finding based on a group of people might apply to you more or less. The bigger the effect, the more likely it is to apply to the majority of us. But even at the medium level, there are some effects that may not apply to us. Now we're thinking about healthy skepticism as a field, as the field of psychology. Now we're not worried about groups. What we're worried about is, can we generate the same finding again? As we learned for exam 1, this is called replication in all types of science, not just psychology. When we find something, we want to be sure that if we repeat the study, the same findings can be reproduced. That's what replication is all about. Remember this guy, Stanley Milgram? Well, he's not going to be on the next exam, but he gives us a good example of replication. Milgram's first book reviews 18 different studies where he used his teacher-learner paradigm. Now, the first few studies, he did everything exactly the same way to see if his findings could repeat. Once we've repeated some findings and shown them to be reproducible, we'll often do a replication and extension. What an extension is we change the method slightly and we see how changing these methods has an impact, or if it has an impact. We might study different people. We might change something up about how we measure the dependent variable. We might change up some aspect of the control variable. For example, in one of Milgram's studies, he had learner and teacher in the same room. And sure enough, changing this variable made people less obedient to authority. So a pure replication is one where we do the study exactly as it was done before. A replication and extension involves changing some aspect of the study to see the impact that it will have. We also care about who's doing the replication. On the one hand, it's pretty normal for early replications to be done by the original researcher, like Milgram. However, for us to really start to believe that they're reproducible, we want to see other researchers do the same study, to replicate the same study, and again reproduce the same findings. As we learned for social psychology, Berger in 2009 replicated several of Milgram's studies and got essentially the same results as what Milgram had. Overall, when we can replicate findings, we're more confident that they're true. So now let's return to our idea of social media and well-being. We've got one experiment that says these things are not good for us, but would those findings replicate And do they hold across different types of studies? One group of researchers sought to see if we extended this work by using a different method, would we still get the same finding? They did what's known as a longitudinal cohort study. These authors are Shimmer et al., and you do not need to know their names. What you need to learn from this slide is what is a longitudinal cohort study. A longitudinal cohort study, what it is kind of in the name. Longitudinal means over time. I like to think of the word longitudinal as longer. It has the word long in it. So most studies are sort of like a small slice in time. In a longitudinal study, we're tracking people over a much longer period of time. What's a cohort? A cohort refers to a group of people. So what a longitudinal cohort study is we are following a group of people over a long period of time. And we're measuring different things at different intervals. In a study like this, what we're going to be looking at is how when social media use goes up, is that associated with a decrease in well-being within this cohort? And when it goes down, is that associated with an increase of well-being? Based on the experiment, our expectation is that when social media usage goes up, we're expecting well-being to go down. However, the researchers doing this study, they did achieve a statistically significant relationship, but the effect size was trivial. It was extremely small, to the point that we don't care. We don't believe that over time, social media usage clearly impacted well-being within this group. Now, if you're watching this video and you're feeling confused, there are two things that you should remember. One, I don't care if you remember the studies about social media. I want you to remember what a cohort longitudinal study is, and I'm only using this as an example. Two, it's not uncommon for studies to produce contrasting results for a wide variety of reasons. And if what you're feeling is like, yeah, but who's right? That's exactly what you should be feeling. And this is what science is designed to figure out over time. We got to do additional studies, several replications, to figure out, to really answer our questions deeply. Brings us to our next research term. And this is the first time we've learned it in this class, so it's really important. There's something known as a meta-analysis. What a meta-analysis is it is a study of studies. In other words, it combines findings from many different studies to create an overall statistic. And that statistic is going to tell us how much consensus is there. In other words, are people consistently finding one thing? Are they consistently finding a different thing? Or are they finding inconsistent things? And this is going to help us figure out what the reliability of our conclusions should be. This particular meta-analysis that I'm telling you about looked at hundreds of studies, and it looked at several outcome variables that it thought social media, that people have studied, that social media might impact. I'm going to tell you about a few, and obviously our key focus is well-being. First, they found no significant relationship with social media use and school performance. Sometimes this surprises students, but I think I can explain this to you a little bit later. Because it wasn't statistically significant, we don't know if these things are related or not, and we don't care, meaning we can't base a decision on this data. But it also found some things, but even these were confusing. For example, it found a medium effect. So it's statistically significant, and it's of a size where we really are starting to care. That social media usage was associated with having more superficial relationships in real life. Well, that doesn't sound so good. But they also found that social media usage helped maintain strong relationships. Well, that sounds good. So that's confusing. Some findings weren't useful at the level of decision making, but could be theoretically useful. For example, they found that increased social media usage resulted in slightly more negative body standards, but because the size of the effect was small, we can't assume that this is going to apply to everybody. Instead, this helps us theorize a little bit, and it helps us inform the next study. Okay, now we're at the crux. Now we're at our main goal. So we've got one experiment saying social media causes lower well-being. We've got a longitudinal cohort study that seems to say the exact opposite thing. When we look across hundreds of studies, what do we see? Well, what we see is the link between social media usage and well-being is pretty small. It's in the trivial range. It doesn't really seem like something that would be useful for us to make recommendations or decisions. So if it's small, does that mean it doesn't have an impact? We don't know. Does it mean it's having an impact? We don't know. What it means when an effect is small is it could be, but we don't know right now. Now, this may surprise a lot of you. You might have thought I was going to get on here and tell you how terrible social media is for you. And I'm not doing that. But does that mean social media has no effect? Probably not. Brings us to our last research term for the day. Sometimes the relationship between two variables will be close to zero, meaning in the trivial range, precisely because other things matter. This can result in mixed results when we've not accounted for those other things. A moderator variable is a variable that changes how two variables are related. It can result in two variables, like social media usage and well-being, appearing to be unrelated in the total group. But once we account for the moderator variable, relationships emerge. Think of moderator variables sort of as things that could increase a person's risk or decrease a person's risk. For example, one possibility, and guys, I'm only using this as a possibility, this isn't real, is it is possible, a small amount of research suggests, that if you have a lot of relationships that you interact with in person, then using social media frequently doesn't have much of a negative impact on you. However, if you have very few in-person friendships, social media might have more of a negative impact on you. In my example, the moderator variable is the equality and amount of your in-person friendships. Having them is a protective factor. Not having them is a risk factor. Metaphorically, you can think of moderator variables as kind of like a dimmer switch. These are variables that may turn up the strength of the relationship. So for example, if I have a lot of risk factors, then it's possible that the more I use social media, the less happy I am. And if I have a lot of protective factors, the more I use social media, it doesn't necessarily impact my well-being, or in some cases, it might even produce positive well-being. This could help explain why in the meta-analyses, we saw that social media use was related to things that can weaken relationships, like more superficial relationships, and related to strengthening relationships. It's possible that if we controlled for a moderator variable, like what is the quality of your relationships, these effects would get even larger. One thing that has been studied is, are you actively or passively using social media? So if you are passively scrolling, this tends to result in an increased negative relationship where using social media passively is more related to lower well-being. Whereas using it actively, meaning I'm using it to connect to friends, I'm using it to share information and have interactions with other people, I'm not just passively scrolling, that tends to be associated with a small positive effect on use. Remember, the point of this slide is to learn what a moderator variable is. Also, don't go too far. Keep your healthy skepticism. While there's some data, the active versus passive is an important moderating variable. It's too soon to draw strong conclusions, and we may need more research before we can actively use these data to tell people or to at least suggest to people how it might be affecting them.